Welcome to Shark Week, here on NES Works episode 145.
I'm your Uncle Buck.
Do I have an uncle?
Unfortunately.
We begin here with a game that perfectly complements our Shark Week theme, National Football League by Norman J. Lewis Games. But we'll be informal here, let's just call them NFL and LJN. At last, you can relive the West Side Story rivalry in video game form by pitting the New York Jets against the San Jose Sharks. Oh, wait, I'm getting a note here. Oh, it turns out the Sharks didn't actually exist yet in 1989, and also they're an NHL team, not NFL. My mistake. Anyway, that really is the name of the game this time. Just plain ol' NFL. Nothing more spelled out. And herein we see the crux of the LJN business model. Gobble up big-name licenses for games that fall well short of the industry standards. Sure, LJN's subcontractors have managed to put out some interesting titles despite the lack of development support by the company, but as much time as I've invested into writing apologias for the likes of Jaws and Friday the 13th, I'd rather just be playing a game that simply achieves its lofty aims and doesn't demand a patient, sympathetic player in order to land. For the most part, though, LJN simply recognized the power of a brand and planned its release schedule accordingly. Heck, the company made its debut in the world with a Fun Club newsletter ad a little bit before they published their first release in late 1987, with an advertisement that teased the different brands that they had locked up. For LJN, the only real effort they felt that they needed to invest into their games fell on the shoulders of their licensing team's meetings at CES. Everything else was incidental. And so we come to NFL, which appears to have been the first American football game to bear the NFL League license in a whole decade, the last having appeared way back in the 1970s on Intellivision. Professional football hadn't quite become the all-encompassing institution it is today, but by 1989 it certainly had begun to edge out baseball as America's favorite pastime. LJN's marketing team took advantage of this fact pretty cleverly by not bothering to give this game an interesting title. It wasn't Battle for the Bowl or Gridiron Mania or anything fun and frothy that other companies might have come up with in order to appeal to the NES's young audience. It was just NFL. The game box stuck that officially licensed Interstate Shield logo right there on the box in bright primary colors that popped against the more muted tones of the rest of the package. And it actually used the word Super Bowl right there in the cover copy, something the NFL probably would have thrown a conniption fit about if they hadn't gotten that license. And in-game, you begin by choosing your favorite real-world teams from either the AFC or NFC, all of whom appear on the field in their actual colors. No other 1980s football team had offered that, so LJN had fans' attention right off. Of course, once you start to play, you realize that none of the footballers have names. Instead, the stat sheet simply refers to them by position. That is because Tecmo had snagged the Players Association license out from under LJN's grasp, giving us Tecmo Bowl, a game where real-world athletes played for thinly veiled samizdat teams that almost, but didn't quite resemble actual franchises. Unfortunately, this is not the only way Tecmo Bowl ate NFL's lunch. Or rather, going by opinions among football-loving NES fans, the way Tecmo Bowl beat up NFL and stole its lunch money. NFL had the poor fortune to be one of those sports games that comes along and does its thing in a perfectly competent fashion by the standards of the time, but which happened to be overshadowed by a recent adaptation that revolutionized the genre. NFL showed up a little too soon after Tecmo Bowl to draw on that game's design lessons, which means that it ended up feeling decidedly stale and clumsy by comparison. Next to Tecmo Bowl, NFL moves at a sluggish pace and lacks precision in its action. Worse though, its interface stinks. Tecmo Bowl figured out how to bring an effective, intuitive coaching interface to a console with a 2-button controller. It depicted team plays on screen in Madden-style X and O layouts before each down and allowed players to use button combinations to secretly select their strategy for the next play without their rival seeing their tactics. It was simple and effective, and NFL offers nothing of the sort. Instead of being able to rely on in-game information, you can only select plays with the help of a packed-in mini-poster reference card. This makes NFL difficult to play if you only have access to the cartridge, which may have been the point, relying on physical reference materials to avoid rentals and trades in the spirit of anti-piracy measures that PC publishers used. But more likely, it just means that Tecmo Bowl came up with a great play that left NFL standing around looking like an amateur. I am admittedly not a football fan. I know, I've never mentioned that before, but it's true. Even so, NFL is clearly a lesser game than Tecmo Bowl, even to my idiot eyes. Less fun to play, less intuitive to play, and far less personable. Tecmo Bowl's individual players with their granular stats and quirks are a lot more interesting than NFL's monolithic teams with their 6 different stat-like lineup options. The one interesting thing that NFL does in terms of its setup is to allow you to allocate a few bonus tweaks to the team stats, shoring up a weakness or two by improving a team's grade in specific areas. However, this comes at a cost. The more you tweak your stats, the more likely you are to pull penalty calls. For stat wonks, this creates an interesting cost-benefit element. Do you juice your team's skills and hope you can power through the added penalties that will result? Or do you stay humble and keep your head low? This, I think, we can attribute to the fact that LJN tapped none other than Atlus to do the grunt work on NFL. Atlus was pretty deep into their RPG making phase at this point, having produced Digital Devil Monogatari Megami Tensei for Namco in 1987, and were probably well into work on 1990's more expansive Megami Tensei 2 by this point. The team attributes and bonus perks absolutely scream RPG stat sheet, effectively allowing you to re-roll your team for one of 6 pre-built party specs. Atlus may not have made a great football game here, but at least their hearts were in a nerdy place. Sadly, this appears to have been the last Atlus-developed game for LJN. After this, the only game LJN hired any Japanese studio to create would be Uncanny X-Men. And even that's not a sure thing, since that flaming train wreck of a cartridge has no credits attached. It's a shame because from this point on, LJN's games wouldn't really be fascinatingly lousy. They'd just be plain old lousy. The reckless, messy spirit of invention that companies like Atlus and Westone poured into their slapdash low-budget work-for-hire LJN projects would disappear, leaving behind games that really did have nothing going for them besides their license. So, underwhelming as NFL may feel in the face of Tecmo Bowl, it's still notable for being the end of an era. RIP LJN's weird early years. We didn't love what we got until it's gone, and we found out a little too late. In that sense, Taito's Skyshark makes a perfect thematic pairing with NFL. No, the two games have nothing whatsoever in common, but despite all their differences, they both represent landmark moments in the behind-the-scenes politics of NES game development. As a game, Skyshark honestly doesn't give us that much to talk about. It's a pretty generic war-themed shooter in the vein of 1943, but without the underlying upgrade system that made 1983's NES port so interesting. That's it, the end. As a piece of software, Skyshark dovetails meaningfully with NFL. While NFL sees LJN bidding farewell to its partnership with Japanese studio Atlus in favor of shifting to Western dev partners, Skyshark represents a surprising new first for the NES, a Japanese publisher outsourcing an NES port to a Western studio. But Jeremy, you complain pedantically, Rare had been making games for Nintendo since Slalom back in 1987! Yes, that's true. And it's also a weird edge case that has no bearing on anything else in the universe. Rare's management had surprising foresight in seeing the potential of the NES in its very earliest days, and they jumped the line by figuring out the innards of the system before the console even reached the UK. They connected with Nintendo and soon found themselves as the go-to for other publishers to handle their development grunt work on the NES, as the market exploded and tons of companies with no game programmers wanted in on the boom. But aside from Nintendo, all of the Rare-developed games we've seen to date were created for Western publishers. Acclaim, Milton Bradley, Tradewest, GameTech, High-Tech Expressions, all of those companies originally hail from the US of A. And until Beam Software's Airwolf showed up in June of 1989, just a couple of months back in terms of the NES chronology, Rare was literally the only non-Japanese company programming NES games. It took that long, more than 2 years, for the rest of the West to catch up with Slalom. So up until this point, the NES's output, Rare and their subcontractors accepted, the NES library has had an overwhelmingly Japanese flavor to it. The arrival of Beam meant that the vanguard of Western development had arrived on the console, But Skyshark heralds an important detail about all of that. Namely, it signals that creative influences have begun to flow in both directions. The NES won't simply be Japanese and Western studios working in isolation from one another, with ideas and content pouring forth from Japan but never going the other way. It's actually pretty fitting that Taito would be the company to break this barrier. Of all major Japanese publishers, Taito arguably had the biggest presence in the US during the 80s. Well, besides Sega, but for some reason they weren't doing a lot of NES publishing. Taito had established an American office during the arcade's heyday, and that outpost played a big part in the launch of games like Jungle Hunt. Not to mention in navigating the legal issues that Jungle Hunt encountered with the estate of Edgar Rice Burroughs. And of course, Taito had been one of the earliest third parties on NES, arriving on platform in the spring of 1987 with The Legend of Kage. Taito relied on external Japanese studios for its early efforts, namely Tosei and Micronix. So Skyshark gives us a real glow-up, coming to us from British developer Software Creations. British and Australian studios like Software Creations and Beam have a pretty poor reputation among NES fans, and not undeservedly. A lot of their output sucked chunks. But here we see a best-case scenario, and a demonstration that you can't judge a studio by its worst output. Otherwise, Nintendo would be the idiots who gave us Stack Up rather than, Mario and Zelda. Software Creations turned out to be a pretty good fit for this collaboration with Taito. The company had gotten its start a few years earlier and primarily specialized in porting Japanese arcade games to popular UK microcomputers. Foremost among these computers was the Commodore 64, a platform powered by a variant of the chip inside the NES. So, not unlike how Satoru Iwata cutting his teeth on the VIC-20 and transplanting that information to the NES, this gave Software Creations programmers a head start on coding for the NES. Although, of course, they still had to get used to the memory limitations and the NES's oddball tile-based video system. Actually, Skyshark may not have been Software Creations' first endeavor for NES. There's some evidence that Rare subcontracted them to help produce world games. But even if that's the case, Skyshark gives us Software Creations with the training wheels off. What we get is a perfectly acceptable little vertical shooter where you control a plane that weaves between bullets while blowing up threats in both the air and on the ground. Though you don't have to worry about alternating between air-to-air and air-to-ground fire here as in certain other games, but you do have to worry about cheap shots. Skyshark loves to use ground cover and other elements to obscure the presence of enemies, and most of your deaths here will come from little guys popping out of nowhere to take a pot shot at you from behind. This is very much a game that began in the arcades and wants you to memorize patterns and placement. But hey, at least it looks good, and it sounds like, well, like nothing else on NES to date. Yes, here we have the NES debut of one of the UK's most legendary chiptune composers, Tim Follin. I have to imagine that Follin found the move from the C64's multi-channel SID chip to the NES's audio system to be a bit like the London Symphony Orchestra's first chair woodwind being forced to perform with a handful of recorders from the closet of an elementary school's music room, but he makes it work. Follin was famous for taking existing tunes and embellishing the hell out of them with driving beats and wild flourishes. Skyshark gives us our first taste of C64-style demo scene music on NES, which you can always identify through those little spiky pulses of vibrating sound that get thrown into the mix. A lot of arrangers back in the day imitated Follin's style, and many of them did it very poorly, emphasizing the grace notes and embellishments over the actual substance of the music, which is to say the melody, creating aggressive blankets of sound that felt completely divorced from the actual games. That's not the case here, and Skyshark's coin-op tunes come through just fine, but with a bouncy energy that makes the game feel perhaps a bit more interesting and exciting than it actually is. I mean, ultimately, this is still a pretty middling take on the shooter genre, but at least it's a very interesting middling take. Next time on NES Works, they're ooky and they're spooky? In this economy?